Okay, we're back, we're live. We're here on Thursday here on ThinkTech Global, and I have the honor of being the host, and Bill Sharp, who is our host of ThinkTech Asia, is here, and he's going to be the guest. And that's one of the reasons is that Bill has been thinking about and studying and visiting Sri Lanka and the Maldive Islands, and we want to hear more about that from him. So Bill Sharp, Asian Affairs commentator on the subject of trouble in Sri Lanka. Welcome to the show, Bill.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
So tell us why you got interested in Sri Lanka and the Maldive Islands.
Well, for some reason, I don't know, when I was in the Army in Vietnam way back when, I sit around every night reading, and somehow I developed interest in Sri Lanka. And I don't know why, but somehow in the back of my mind, I got the idea, oh, that might be a really cool place to live. Not really knowing much about it, and never really, thereafter, never really thought very much about visiting it. I've been to India a few times, as Bangladesh, Nepal. And I thought, well, reaching deep into my memory, I thought, maybe you should visit there. And and if you go to Sri Lanka, not that far away is the Maldive Islands. So, hey, 2 in 1, right? Economize. So that's what we did last October, and spent about a week or so, a little longer, I guess, in Sri Lanka.
Why don't we say where exactly it is? Sri Lanka is the successor to Ceylon, used to be called Ceylon.
There you go.
And that really goes back a long way. Oh, we have a map. Here's a map.
There we go. Actually, do we have the other one? Yeah, there we go. Okay, so there is the subcontinent, and the most prominent country in the subcontinent is India, of course. And then you probably see Bangladesh there, and of course, if you have India, you have Pakistan. And then off the southeast corner of India, in purple, lavender perhaps, I'm not sure what color, I'm going colorblind, so anyway, that sort of pear-shaped island is Sri Lanka. A very friendly place, interesting, very historic. A lot of historic sites and ruins to see there. Actually, much more than I ever realized before I began to investigate it as a travel destination.
Mm-hmm. It's an island, though. Sri Lanka is
an island.
So are the Maldives, certainly. But how big is it with respect to, for example, Texas?
Well, I don't know the exact square miles of Sri Lanka. I'm going to guess, and this is just a bit of a wild guess, about 100, no more than 150 miles from north to south, maybe, I don't know, 30 miles wide.
It's not that big then.
Oh, it's not that big. The population is 23 million, very similar to the population of Taiwan, actually. Mm-hmm. Densely populated in places.
And the Maldives, the Maldives, that's a smaller place, yeah.
Yeah, that's smaller. It's 1,200 islands, or as they call them, atolls. Mm-hmm. Population is far less. It's no more than 350,000. The capital city, Mali, or Mal, as some people call it, depending on your pronunciation, I think the population there is, if I recall, about 120,000. It's all sandwiched on this one island, and very densely populated. Boats are really popular, a necessity in the Maldives, going from island to island to island. And
it's a separate country, though.
It's a separate country, yeah. Interestingly enough, the U.S. doesn't have an embassy there, doesn't have a consulate. It's U.S. diplomatic affairs for the Maldives are handled by the embassy in Sri Lanka. And I suppose there's some historical parallel for that in the sense that the Maldives was a British colony and a British protectorate, colony protectorate, however you want to go, up until, I believe it was 1965, and then it got full independence. During the time that it was part of the British Empire, its affairs were handled by the British colonial government in Sri Lanka. So now India and China have embassies there because India and China, they're maneuvering for influence in the Maldives. Both these places, Sri Lanka, if we could put that map up again. There we go. You can see they're right out there in the Indian Ocean, and these are terribly strategic, both Sri Lanka and the Maldives. And way back when the West first began to discover East, the Portuguese, they saw the strategic significance of Sri Lanka, as I'm sure did the British. You know, sort of, they're right there on the, what should we call it, the highway connecting the Indian Ocean with the Arabian Sea. And all of that ultimately leads up to the Middle East and Middle Eastern oil fields. The Chinese have a lot of interest in this area. This whole area of Burma, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, the Maldives. And because these all, from China's strategic point of view, these all constitute part of the new Chinese maritime Silk Road and the so-called pearls of the Indian Ocean, where they want to be able to securely transport oil from the Middle East, down the Arabian Sea, around the tip of India, and then to the Straits of Malacca.
The Straits of Malacca between Sri Lanka and India, is that what it is?
No. The Straits of Sri Lanka, I'm not sure if we can see it there, is in between Indonesia and Malaysia. It's a really important waterway. And then from there, turn north, and you're in the South China Sea, headed for Chinese ports. So, yeah, a really important area to China. And the other thing is that China sees India as a potential competitor. And they want to sort of do what they can. You know, the Chinese are always talking about US containment of China. Well, actually, I don't really quite believe that. But I think there is a Chinese containment policy of India. Because you see in these places, just as I mentioned, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Pakistan, Burma, Myanmar.
It's all around India.
It's all around India, and there's China is building ports, deep water ports, and yeah, they can be used for trade, but they also have military significance too. There's one thing that has terribly upset the Indians is the presence or the visit of Chinese submarines to the Sri Lanka on 2 occasions. In the very southern tip of Sri Lanka, the Chinese are building a deep water port, complete or next to a new international airport. And it's felt that these could have, you know, great military significance for Chinese submarines.
So the Chinese have been able to negotiate deals with Sri Lanka to build these military facilities. True. That is something. This probably upsets the relationship between Sri Lanka and India.
Oh, terribly so. Let me just hit on one other point, too, to finish out this idea about submarines. In the Maldives, too, the Chinese are talking about building a sub-base. Now, there was I didn't see it, because it's on the southernmost island, or the second southernmost island in the Maldives, what formerly was a pretty significant British Air Force base. And it played a big role in the economy there, as you can imagine. The Chinese are talking about, as I said, building a submarine base there. That's got India concerned. I don't see where the US is paying a whole lot of attention to this area, but I think it's ultimately got to be of concern to the US as well. So that's the thing. Now,
is the US building countervailing facilities to
well,
protect India?
Could we put that map up again, the one with the Maldives? Okay, now if you look, how about the other one? Sorry. Yeah, there you go. You see that rectangle, that encloses all the land area under the control of the Maldivian government. North of that is a group of islands which is part of India called the Lakdive Islands. It doesn't really appear very well on that map. And south of it is another group of islands called the Chagos Islands. And in the Chagos Islands, the biggest island is called Diego Garcia. That is part of the, what do they call that? The British Indian Ocean Overseas Territory. I think I got that right. And the U.S. has a long-term lease on a base there, Diego Garcia, which is a very important role, plays a very important role in that part of the world. One thing is the relationship between Sri Lanka and the United States has been somewhat strained because Sri Lanka went through a very horrendous civil war. Depending how you calculate or determine starting dates and ending dates, well, most people would agree it ended 5 years ago. Exactly when it started, some people say 25 years ago, some people say 30 years ago.
The damage hasn't been repaired, though.
The damage has not been repaired. And the basic groups, there are three basic groups of people in Sri Lanka. One are the Sinhalese. These are the majority. They're Buddhists, very strong Buddhists. And then there's the Muslims, and then there's the Tamils. The Tamils have very close connections with India, all right? And the Tamils have always felt that they've been heavily discriminated against in society and essentially wanted to break away from Sri Lanka and join up with India. And of course, the government in Colombo didn't want that. They wanted to hold the country together. So there was a civil war. It was pretty bloody. I don't know off the top of my head, I can't think of the exact number of people who died, but I think it left deep scars in the society. And when I was there, they were just celebrating 5 years after this war is over, the reconnection, or the reoperation, the reopening of the rail line going from Colombo, the capital, to Jaffna in the northeast. Jaffna is kind of the center of Tamil culture in Sri Lanka, 5 years after the fact. I did not personally visit that part of Sri Lanka. I understand there's still a lot of visible war damage, which I think is probably true. I mean, 5 years afterwards, it's pretty hard to fix things. Look how long it took us to get the new World Trade Center up.
Yeah, but it was never a highly advanced country to begin with.
That's true. Never very highly advanced. Basically agricultural country.
Yeah.
As I was saying before we went there, wonderful tea. If you're a tea lover, you've got to go to Sri Lanka. It's really great tea.
Ceylon tea, right?
Ceylon tea.
We grew up with that.
Yeah, Ceylon. Yeah, that's right. We all grew up with that.
Okay, so we got the general picture.
Okay.
They're not too far from each other. There's a geographical relationship, if not a cultural or racial one. That there are problems with the Chinese trying to get a foothold in both places. India legitimately concerned.
Right.
The government's still affected by this civil war.
Right.
Only a few years ago, and now we're going to take a snapshot of what happened in Sri Lanka as a tourist destination and as a place where a presidential election recently took place.
That election, well, I guess we should do the tourist part first. But before we do that, I have one slide which focuses on the flag of Sri Lanka. Could we please put that up? I love flags because flags can really tell a lot. And I think it's so true of this flag. So let me explain. Okay, the green rectangular part of the flag is supposed to represent the Muslim segment of Sri Lanka's population. The orange rectangular space is supposed to represent the Tamil segment of the Sri Lankan populace. The other part, the maroon part with the lion holding the sword, this is supposed to represent the majority Sinhalese. Those little leaves that you see in each corner, they represent one precept or the other of Buddhism. If I just look at that flag, I think, yes, it's very colorful and very decorative, but it also suggests to me an inborn prejudice against non-Sinhalese. And I have to say, sometimes we think of Buddhists as being very, peaceful and gentle. And that's a misnomer, because if I look at Myanmar, that's a heavy
Perfect
Buddhist
example,
country.
yeah. Violent.
And violent, violence, extreme violence led by Buddhist clerics against Muslim people. And I say the same thing in Sri Lanka, too. So I think there's a lot to Buddhism that's good, but it's got some downsides, too. And I think the downside is it's hurting Sinhalese society. I was, when I was there was a big election going on. You touched on the election. Maybe we should go there.
We're going to
come back
go
to
to a break.
Okay, let's go to a break.
And then we're going to talk about the election. It's a good time to take a break.
Okay, good.
That's Bill Sharp, Asian Affairs commentator here at ThinkTech. We're on ThinkTech Global today, and we're talking about the trouble in Sri Lanka. I'm Jay Fidell, and I love being here. We'll be right back.
Ted Ralston, folks, host of our show at ThinkTech Hawaii called Where the Road Leads, where we talk about technology influencing the future of Hawaii. Technology, of course, is the art of solving problems. We always bring in interesting and informed guests who can see from different perspectives and different points of view how that future might unfold and how technology can assist us in getting there. So once again, join us 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock on Fridays. Ted Ralston, your host. And please, if you have ideas that you'd like us to address on this show or folks who you think should be on it, let us know.
Aloha, my name is Josh Green. I host a show called Healthcare in Hawaii here on ThinkTech. We get together once a week or sometimes twice a month. Depends when we're busy. We get together less often, but we love to see you here to talk about the preeminent healthcare issues in our state. Our programs vary very widely. We talk about economics, we talk about healthcare, we talk about social issues on this program. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, we're back. We're live. We're here with Bill Sharp, Asian Affairs commentator, here on ThinkTech Global. We're talking about trouble in Sri Lanka. So, there were presidential elections not too long ago.
Right.
And this is an interesting time for those to take place. What happened? What were the implications?
Well, the incumbent president, Mr. Rajapaksa, I hope I pronounced that correctly, he'd been in office for a while. Now, as I understand it, there are term limits in Sri Lanka. And he was maneuvering to get the term limits amended and apparently put some pressure on the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and some other notables in Sri Lankan society. I think that, you know, it'd be fair to say he enjoyed power. And I was there just during the election period. His picture was absolutely everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. And I myself was a little bit concerned about some of the speeches he was making because in that English is widely spoken and widely used in Sri Lanka. They have a number of English language newspapers, so I was reading them every day, trying to get smart on the election. And some of the statements he was making were, if he made them in this country, he'd be in some pretty serious trouble.
Like what?
Oh, well, he was definitely saying some pretty discriminatory things about the Tamils because his political base is the Sinhalese, yet he's the one that wants to reunify the country. Pretty difficult to do.
Back to the flag again.
Back to the flag.
The flag tells you.
The flag tells you a lot. I mean, I really do think that flags and national anthems, they tell you a lot. And you might not realize it at first, but the closer you look at them, there are lessons to be learned there. And he also was considered to be very much in the crony politics, putting all his family members in charge of important components of the government. Also considered to be a little too close to China. And I mentioned just before the break that at the very southern tip of Sri Lanka, there was a big Chinese deep water port being built, and right next to it, a new international airport. Well, guess what? That's his home district. And guess what? His son represents that district in Parliament. And there was a lot of money borrowed from China. He kind of cozied up, as far as I can tell, to China, not only for the economic benefit, but because when the Civil War was raging, the United States, and I would assume probably the European Union and some other countries, were dismayed about his attitudes, his way of pursuing that war against the Tamils, and thought that was an abridgment of human rights. And so that cast cold water on the relationship, and which now, with the election of the new president, Mr. Saracena, seems to have the possibility of warming up. But it seemed that
What's the name of the new president again?
Mr. Saracena.
Saracena.
Saracena, S-I-R-I, Sina.
Okay.
And it seemed that a lot of people were just very, very uncomfortable with his cozy relationship with China. By the way, there was an 81% turnout of voters.
That's twice as much as Hawaii.
Yeah, it's twice as much as Hawaii. We're always bringing up the rear. Mr. Saracena actually had been a confidant of Mr. Rajapaksa before. He had been Minister of Health. He'd also been Minister of Defense. But he began to see trouble with Mahinda Rajapaksa. And so he ran for the presidency. Now, I guess the question is, India, of course, was happy about this result because Mr. Saracena said that he wanted a foreign policy that was less dependent on China. I mean, he's certainly not going to jettison the relationship with China, but it seems like he's going to tame it down. He wanted a relationship, he wanted to ramp up the relationship with India, repair it, move it forward. He wanted a relationship with Japan. And he also emphasized, and I didn't really quite understand this at first, an important relationship with Pakistan. And I'm still not sure I quite understand that.
Pakistan is thousands of miles away, isn't it?
Yeah, well, Pakistan is a large Islamic country, too. And it seems that at various times, Pakistan has been very friendly towards Sri Lanka. Maybe not always in the ways that Mr. Saracena might most appreciate. But I understand that during the Civil War, they supplied a lot of weaponry and ammunition to Rajapaksa. Mm-hmm. But he definitely wants that connection. And so he's talking about a foreign policy that's focused on Pakistan, India, China, and Japan. He didn't mention, and things that I've read, he did not mention the United States, but I believe his foreign minister is visiting Washington next month.
Yeah, it seems that'd be part of the package, because the United States is warming up with India these days.
Right.
And
absolutely.
So it's one follows the other for sure.
Right.
But this is the first, am I right? This is the first significant change of power, this election, since the Civil War, am I right?
Oh, yeah, right. Since the Civil War, this is the first significant change of power.
This is a historical moment then, because you've change of leadership from the outcome of that war to somebody who is changing foreign policy of the country.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I guess in a way, I also kind of wonder, now, if we look at Myanmar, I got to remind myself it's not Burma anymore, it's Myanmar. I always have to sort of remind myself, write myself little notes. It's not Burma, it's
They do
Myanmar.
too, they have to remind themselves.
You know, Myanmar went through a big change of saying, hey, you know, we're getting a little too close to China here. China's getting kind of pushy. They want to develop our rivers to their liking, and we don't really see much benefit to it. And I think it's difficult to believe that Myanmar can ever really just completely shut off China. I mean, it is a neighbor. And in the same token, I don't think that Sri Lanka can either, but they certainly seem like they want to distance themselves from it. Yet they do still have some pretty big outstanding loans that are owed to China, so there's still connection there.
Well, it's not the loans that exist now, but the next loans, right?
Just the next loans,
so,
right?
You know, they got to curry favor to that, to that extent.
Could we just put that map back up there again? Now, this doesn't really show it completely, but you see, we talked about how these pearls on the Indian Ocean, well, actually, all the way from the, let me see, the islands off the coast of Burma, through the Bay of Bengal to Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, all this which leads into the Middle East. But can we move that map over a little bit? The other way, to the left, to my left. I don't know if that's to your right or the other way. Yeah, I'm sorry, it doesn't show that.
There's not enough room, yeah.
Just not enough room. But on the other side of the Arabian Sea is Africa. And of course, China is making a big stand in Africa. And so if you have those pearls, that not only gives you access to the Middle East, but it also gives you access to Africa. And this all is very much playing in China's strategic thinking these days. So this area was really becoming quite important to them, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens.
You know, it's interesting that China is actually a long way from Sri Lanka.
Yeah, it is.
In miles.
Right.
And yet they have a military base there, you know, an extension.
A possible military base, yeah.
And so forth. And you know, it strikes me that aside from Diego Garcia, there is not a big American presence in that area.
That's absolutely true.
And we are one behind, because as the Chinese expand their influence all the way to Africa, control all those resources, we're missing in action.
You know, I think that, on this map, we can see how the Arabian Sea, you know, is the road of access in Africa. You see Somalia, and, well, we don't see any other African countries, but we know Somalia is in Africa. So this is a hugely important. Yeah.
Okay, so let's go further here.
Okay.
And look at the parliamentary elections that also took place.
They will take place.
Okay.
Yeah, they're coming up. I believe in March.
Okay.
I'm not sure. I haven't seen any firm predictions about how they're going to go, but certainly the new president's got to be concerned about them.
I mean, are they going to have like an American standoff here? A cliff thing, you know, a polarization of the executive and the legislative. Is that possible? Has it happened before? Is that part of this risk here?
As I understand the Sri Lankan political system, there's a parliamentary system, and then from whoever gets the majority in parliament gets to name the prime minister. Okay, the president is directly elected.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Who's more important?
It would seem to me probably the president, yeah, especially with the powers amassed by the previous president. I'm sure that Mr. Sirisena, in a very noble sense, he might want to dilute some of those powers, but that's probably hard to do as well, especially if he wants to achieve change.
Mm-hmm. Could there be a risk that the two won't agree on things?
That the two might agree?
Yeah, I mean, like the prime minister and the president would take a different position on things?
I suppose that's possible. And what happens in that case, frankly speaking, I'm not really sure. And just what the legislative mechanism might be or the legal mechanism might be for handling it, I'm not really sure.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thing about this, I mean, what I would take away is that the parliamentary systems around the world, there are many, many of them, especially in the pathway of British territorialization, are different. They're not the same at all.
Right.
And sometimes one figure is more powerful than others.
Right.
And the way differences get resolved could be different, and the way majority groups in the legislature may come together, Parliament may come together, might be different. And then, of course, it is another element here is that they're just out of a civil war, which shadows all of this.
Right.
And civil wars are never really over. It takes a long time for it to be over.
Well, you know, that's a very interesting point. And I guess before our last break, we're kind of talking about this. Maybe we go back there. I think you're absolutely right about that. Yeah, the war's over, nobody's shooting. But that doesn't mean that everything is peaches and cream either. I mean, I think you can see that, like in Germany, right? Okay, yeah, we have a unified Germany, but still, you can see the distinctions between the old East Germany and West Germany. And just in the city of Berlin, if you go from West Berlin across to East Berlin, there might not be any wall up now, but you know you're in a different area. If you think about Vietnam, the North is distinctly different than the South, and it's been unified, whatever you want to call it, for nearly 40 years. So it takes a long time to smooth this stuff out, if it's ever smoothed out.
So let me ask you this. I mean, Bill, would you consider Sri Lanka stable now?
You know, that's very interesting because as we've been talking about this, I've just been sitting here speaking, yet in the back of my mind, thinking the same question. Well, as far as I can see, I think it is. Although there was some suggestion that in this election, after this election, there might be a coup. And from what I've read about Sri Lankan political history, it's had some pretty tumultuous eras. You know, there have been a few assassinations thrown in there. Certain families have gained power at the highest level, held on to it, and been eliminated via an assassin. In fact, you know, Southeast Asia is sort of, South Asia sort of has this problem. I remember, what was it I believe it was all in 1 year. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, very, very bright Prime Minister of Pakistan, was hung by General Zah, I think his name was, on fairly spurious charges, I believe. Indira Gandhi was assassinated by her own bodyguards. And then over in Bangladesh, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, I think I butchered that name just a little bit. He was also assassinated.
I'm staying in Hawaii.
All in 1 year. And actually, there's been some similar antics in the Maldives. Everything has not been
Let's hear about the Maldives after the commercial.
After the commercial.
Okay, a little breathing space there.
Okay.
Bill Sharp, Asian Affairs commentator here on ThinkTech Global, talking about trouble in Sri Lanka and by extension to the Maldive Islands. We'll be right back.
Aloha, I'm Keli'i Akina, president of the Grassroot Institute and host on Ehana Kako, a weekly program on the ThinkTech Hawaii broadcast network. Ehana Kako means let's work together. Think of the sad alternative, let's not work together. Here in Hawaii, with all of our diversity and the richness of the people, it's important for us to come together around issues on the basis of what's right and what's good and what's going to serve the common good. And that's what we try to do at Ehana Kako. Every week we interview movers and shakers, people in government, business, and other sectors of society to talk about how to create together a better government, economy, a better world here in Hawaii that can bless the rest of the world. I thank you for your attention to ThinkTech Hawaii, and we look forward to seeing you every Monday, 2 to 3 p.m. on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. We're Ehana Kako, and we wish you well. Aloha.
We're back. We're live with Bill Sharp here on a Thursday afternoon in ThinkTech Global. Bill is an Asian Affairs commentator here, and in fact, he's the host of ThinkTech Asia. We're talking about trouble in Sri Lanka, and one of the things to get to is the implication that in this part of the world, every coup is somehow a military coup, and then to ask Bill, if we're talking about the possibility of a military coup and the military being involved in a, what do you want to call it, unlawful change of government,
Right.
Where are the Chinese on that? Because the Chinese have a presence in Sri Lanka, which is essentially military, and they must be close. I mean, I would imagine they're close to the military, so if there were a coup, the Chinese would not be far away, no?
Well, there was some suggestions after the election, according to one commentator whose analysis I was reading, that there might be a coup in the offing. If there were, it seems to have tamed out. China's response to that would be, we never interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. That is the premise upon which our foreign policy is built. And at one time, I think that was true when China was isolated from the rest of the world. But as China becomes more involved in the world, I think that that tenet of Chinese foreign policy is becoming less and less credible.
Well, look at the practical effect here. You have a guy who won for president, who is distancing himself from the Chinese, and changing policy,
Right.
moving toward India,
Right.
and that's a threat to the Chinese.
Sure.
The Chinese have just invested an enormous amount of money in the islands there at the south of Sri Lanka, right?
Right.
They can't afford to lose that. They have presumably existing relations with the leaders of the military.
Sure.
It's hard to resist,
Right.
isn't it?
It's hard to resist when countries are offering you hardware and other things like that. So I do believe, I could be wrong about this, that a significant number of armaments in the Sri Lankan military have come from China. The aircraft, I was talking to a member of the Air Force, interestingly enough, who I ran into in a hotel. And the aircraft are all I believe, Su-27s, Russian, right? MiG-29s, Russian aircraft in any case. Yeah.
You know what this suggests, though, is that the guy who won the elections, I'm not even going to try to pronounce this name, Sirisena.
I think I'm pronouncing it right, but I could be wrong too.
He has certain boundaries that are created by these considerations we've been
Sure,
talking about.
sure.
I mean, if he wanted to really make a move on India and connect up with Modi and President Obama, that would entail a certain amount of risk that he has an exposure to a coup, a greater exposure to a coup.
That's
because
a
the
very
Chinese
good
would be
point.
more likely to generate that coup.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point. I think he probably does need to tread carefully, given the fact that some people have definitely lost out, given the fact that there is somewhat of a history of violence in Sri Lankan politics. Yeah, he has to tread carefully.
Well, let's move to the Maldive Islands for a minute, okay?
Let me just interject a point, because
Please.
this is something we were talking about before. And when you're saying that there's not a whole lot of U.S. interest in this area, which I think is probably true, other than the base in Diego Garcia. I think maybe we need to change our perceptions in Washington. And some folks have suggested as strategic thinkers. This one in particular, I don't always agree with what he says, but he's definitely a strategic thinker and highly intelligent. We often talk in terms of the Asia-Pacific region. But in actuality, Asia-Pacific kind of cuts out South Asia, India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal. It might better serve the interests of American foreign policy if we thought of this as the Indo-Pacific region. And then perhaps we'd have a more holistic policy to approach these countries.
So you're actually more than just an Asian affairs commentator, you're an Indo-Asian affairs commentator. Okay, let's move to the Maldives, because somehow the Maldives play into this.
Sure.
You said there were, thousands of islands there.
1,200, yeah.
Hundreds. Is it like I can see one island from another?
No. From Mal, the capital, to the more distant islands, but if you go by boat, could take a few hours, maybe even a half day. To go from Mal by plane to the southernmost island, I think it's sort of like going from here to Hilo, from Honolulu to Hilo, 45 minutes or so. It's really quite spread out. And some of these islands, it's really interesting. Tourists are just flocking to the Maldives left and right, especially Chinese, because these outer islands, this is what they call the uninhabited outer islands, have all been turned into very upscale tourist destinations.
Really? How
Very,
interesting.
very pricey. some, as I recall, $1,000 a night. I mean, very, very
Can't
pricey.
even find that in Waikiki.
Can't even find it. I mean, they make Hawaii look cheap. And Chinese are floating in there left and right, and tourists from other places. I mean, you know.
So who's building these things?
International hotel chains like Westin and Wyndham and Hilton.
What's so attractive there that it would become a tourist destination?
I guess it's the allure, you know, the mystique. Also, well, the water's quite nice, very clear, and you know, living in Hawaii, I mean, I'm not going there to go swimming, although I did to say I've been in the
but you
Indian
know,
Ocean.
I mean, it's what's really interesting, Bill, and I'd like to take just a moment and digress on it. You know, we think that our beaches are the best in the world.
Yeah.
Watch with climate change. Let's see what happens there. We think our weather is great,
Yeah.
but watch with climate change. We think our infrastructure is terrific. Watch what happens with the passage of time. Watch. Okay, and we think there's nowhere like Hawaii, and nobody can compete with us. But here, you have a very exotic place.
Very
You have a
exotic.
very fancy infrastructure. You probably have a global clientele that come around there that make it interesting, and you have global quality hotels that come around.
Oh,
and,
yeah,
and make it beautiful, and the food is great, and all
Right.
that, and service is great.
Service is superb.
So if you can get there,
Yeah.
sounds to me like a lot of people would rather go there.
I think you probably have a point. Boy, when you talk about the infrastructure, I just think about the roads in Honolulu, which are pretty disgusting. Really disgusting. And why is it taking 5 years to fix them? Anyway, so some of these islands, or atolls as they call them, they're what they call non-inhabited, and these hotel chains have taken over there and developed their Sheraton and, you know, all of those guys. And then they have these other islands that are inhabited, and this means that indigenous people live there. And some of them don't allow any kind of foreign hotels, okay? And then there is a mixing on some islands. It's kind of tricky because outside of the purely tourist islands, a very strict Islamic law is in play. And like women are not, on these islands, are not allowed to swim in bikinis. And I saw women on one island swimming with all of their, you know, Muslim-like dress on.
Not fun.
Not fun. I mean, it was a little shocking. You know, I've seen a pretty lot of things, but I was kind of like,
Well, it's interesting. It's, you know, it's worth following in your footsteps to take a look at it. You know, we're between civil wars, so it's probably stable and a nice experience. Those hotels will protect us. But I think we want to do one more thing before we close, Bill.
Okay.
We want to take a look at the Maldive flag to see what your interpretation of the flag is.
Okay,
and what
let's
this
do
tells
that.
us about
Let's
the
do that.
Maldive Islands. Here we go with the Maldive flag.
Well, I'm not sure I have a really good interpretation of this. The green represents Islamic. It's Sunni Islamic, very strict. The Maldives became Islamic due to the influence of a visiting Moroccan. I forget exactly when it was. I think it was in the 1600s. The crescent there, the white crescent, represents Islam. I don't know about the red border. I'm going to guess. I think this is probably wrong, though. I think it represents the fact that the red border is enclosing the green Islamic field with a white crescent. That's supposed to represent the island nature of the Maldives. But that's a guess, purely a
Bill,
guess.
you know, one thing that comes out of both of these flags and this discussion, and maybe needs to be emphasized at the last, I just like to make my closing comment, and is that we could never forget that these areas you've been talking about are in an Islamic part of the world.
That's for sure.
And there is Islam everywhere in this part of the world.
That is true.
However it works, whether it works well or not, it's there in every place. That's Bill Sharp, Asian Affairs and Indo-Asia Affairs commentator here on ThinkTech Global. We've had a very interesting discussion about the trouble, to the extent there is trouble, in Sri Lanka and the Maldive Islands. And I really would like to do this again with you, Bill. Thanks very much.
Thank you.